All right, welcome to Sass Bites. This is your weekly bite of Sass during your lunch break. My name is Micah. You can follow me down there, Micah Godbolt on Twitter, as well as Sass Bites on Twitter. It's where we put out all of our upcoming shows and links and all those types of things. And if you want to catch up on old episodes, we've been doing this for a little while. You can go to youtube.com/sassbites and catch up on all the old shows there as well. So today we're going to be diving back into Susy grids. A number of episodes ago, in the 20s or 30s. It's been a little while. We had Eric Suzanne come on and give us a talk about Susy grids. He's the one of the original author, one of the co-authors now, main author of it. I'll give him credit for that. Of the grid system, of the Sass grid system. And he came on and talked to us about Susy 2.0 and what's changed and some of the new cool stuff. But we really didn't get a chance to dive in too much into kind of the nitty gritty of like, how do you really use it? Like, what are all these settings? What are all the features, and how do we actually set up a Susy project? So that's what we're going to do today. It's going to take us a while because there's a lot of stuff to go through. I threw out a tweet about the documentation for Susy, and it's really extensive. And actually, there is a new interesting little thing on the sidebar of this that I am going to take advantage of. It allows me to send some links out here with the called Showcase. We're going to put that out. Comes up in the sidebar. Other people might be able to get to it too. So I'm going to put that as well as the Sassmeister in there. And I'm kind of curious to see what those show up. We'll see if they might show up with the video or something later. There they go. They're in the sidebar. So if you're watching in the Google Hangout, you should probably see those pop through. Anyway, so we're going to dive into, if you check out that Sassmeister link, that's exactly the code I'm going to be using and going through the settings. So if you want to follow along, you can, or you can just watch. That's fine too. Don't dive too far deep into the code below it, because there's a lot of Susy code down there that is actually a little bit verbose, partially because I need to make code that was going to work for all of my settings without breaking. So not exactly best practice code down below. I just wanted to be able to get it set up so you could see what all these settings are all about. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and go over to this desktop here. Cool. All right. So you can see here's the Sassmeister. I'm just going to do it local. It gives me a little bit more space on my screen to do that. And stop that. All right. Good to go. So here are the Susy variables. You can see on the right here, we've got, actually let's look at the markup real quick. I've got a pretty basic kind of page you might come across that has like a header up top, then a little hero section that has a couple different divs in it. One of the divs has some more divs nested inside of it. We might want to do something fun with that. And then we kind of have a gallery down here below that has 6 different elements inside of it. And we want to make a grid out of it. And that's exactly what Susy is great for, is be able to make these grids that are, flexible and really easy to set up and really easy to make changes to. So that's the grid we're going to be working with. And what we're going to take a look at is all of these settings. These are all the settings that are available, all the global settings that are available for every single grid that you set up. And here's the kicker. You can actually have multiple grids per project. So we're going to show you how to set up one grid for your project and all the settings that are in that. And then we'll talk later about how you can do multiple grids and use those differently. So first thing we're going to do, we'll take a look. Actually, let me go ahead and do this. Hopefully this doesn't break everything. One thing, you can always do, the grid layout has two different ways to specify the settings. One is you can use this little function, this Susy variable is kind of the base variable that your layout's going to go into. And then you can use this layout function. 12 columns, half column grids, fluid, float, outside. We'll talk about those later. But you can just throw those all into this function if you want to. And you can set all your variables like that and not have to worry about using this larger map, a little bit more verbose settings. But I kind of like verbose because it makes it really obvious as to what fluid, float, and outside are actually referring to. So let's go ahead and do kind of the long version. And we're just going to start at the top. Again, we're going to work our way down about what all of these different features do. So flow, LTR, RTL, that might be a little bit obvious, but left to right or right to left. So with Susy, you have the ability to really easily, and let's see if I'm live reloading. Come on, demo. Did I right to left? Did I just spell it wrong? There it goes. Thank you. I probably just spelled it wrong. Okay. So you can see it's now going from right to left. So we have 1, 2, 3 instead of 1, 2, 3. This is really great if you need to have maybe a different layout for left to right languages versus right to left languages. And you can, with a single variable in your layout, you can change that. LTR. There we go. All right, let's go, demo. You can work. All right, the next thing is the type of output we're using. Susy comes with two built-in, either a float layout or an isolate layout. If you've used Zen grids, if you use Singularity, they take advantage of the isolate layout as well. So let me show you the difference here. If we look down in our inspector, we can see the code for this hero.2. It's got a width, it's got a float, and it's got a margin right of 0 because it's the last element in the list. This first one is, has a margin right of 4. Anyway, so it's using float left and margin right just to basically lay things out. If I change things to isolate, yes, use code completion. That's easier. All right, you're going to see that the page doesn't really change. Well, it doesn't change at all. It's the exact same layout, but it's using a different method to do the layout. You can see here we've still got the same width and the same float, but we're using this little margin kind of hack trick where it's setting a negative right margin of 100% and then a left margin to pull it back in. And this is a long conversation itself. There's large blog articles that go through and it kind of explain how this isolate method works. But really what it allows you to do is it's kind of an absolute positioning of the layout world. So it will actually allows you to change the order. It basically allows you to absolutely position an element on that left to right axis with a percentage, and you don't have to worry about the float order. So if you're trying to do some really weird layouts where something's moving, the order of elements are moving all over the place, isolate is really, really handy for that. Oftentimes it's a little bit overkill. Float works just fine. So we're just going to switch back to that, but you can see the difference. It takes out those odd margin left, margin right. And let's wait for that to get back. There we go. All right. Live reload doesn't always work exactly perfectly. Okay, our math. Susy 2, let's see. Susy 1 always assumes static, I believe. Hopefully I'm not misquoting Eric there. It assumes static. Assume like you're using actual numbers to go into the columns, at least for max widths, I believe. With Susy 2, it's first assuming fluid. It's not using any like actual pixel values or M values. It's using all widths, percentage values, which you can see down there. Now we can change that if we do need to do static. Now if we do static, we need to make sure to pass in a column width. Otherwise it doesn't know what to do. And so now you see that our width is 375 pixels. So we're not using percentages anymore. We're using actual pixel values. So if you need static widths, or maybe you're doing more of an adaptive layout where you've got like 3 different breakpoints and you've got a specific width for each of those breakpoints, you could totally do that and have a different grid for each one of them. Well, maybe we'll demo that one later. But that's static versus fluid right there. So back to fluid. Fluid is going forward is really probably the more useful one and the better all-around one to use, but oftentimes static will come in handy. This container. Container is, there's a container mixin that you can throw on your containers. So like this page has a container mixin on it. Right now the container mixin is just max with 100, margin left, margin right auto. So there's just like, it's not doing anything besides max with 100%. Yay, that's not going to do much. But if I want to change this, I could just say I want a 960 pixel grid. I can go ahead and do that. And actually my screen is not big enough to be able to see it. You can actually see down there it changed to max width of 960. Let's go 660. There we go. So we can see it actually change. So if we want to actually set a max width on our containers and then have everything else be percentages inside of it, that works really well. And again, that might actually be a better option if you're doing like those static, like 3 breakpoints or 3 different size pages. Anyway, your mileage may vary. You can also actually pass percentages in here. So if you want to say 75% or something like that, you totally can. There we go, or 50% or 25%. And the grid just works. I mean, obviously the content blows up on you, but the grid works just fine. So we'll go back to auto for now. Actually, no, let's leave it back at 700 pixels with this next area. Let's go 6 so you can see a little bit more. All right, container position, again, is a real simple one. Is do you want that container centered? Do you want it left? Do you want it right? So we can go left, and burp, it's going to pop over left. We can go right. And oftentimes this is just the style that you want to be using for for your site, and that's great. You can also pass a width in. That actually, I'm going to put this back to auto. And what this does is it gives you, in Susy 1 terms, I was trying to find this, it gives you grid padding. So if you're used to grid padding in Susy 1, this is exactly where you set it. So what it's going to do is it's going to give me exactly 100 pixels on the edge. So there's always going to be 100 pixel of padding around it. Of course, 100 is probably a little much for for this, but you get the idea. Where we can set the amount of padding on the outside. And again, it just gives you margin left, margin right with a max width right there. Oftentimes really helpful for maybe smaller breakpoints and those kind of things. Do what works for you. All right. So the next thing I want to show is last flow. And the point with this is there's 2 different ways you can do the last element in a row. Let's take a look at 3 right here. So 3, am I still in isolate? I feel like it's doing isolate. Oh, I think I know why. I will go back. I'll do these. I'm using a gallery thing, which is something different, which apparently is messing things up. So we'll look at 2 here. So right now 2 has a width of 65%-ish, and it's got a float of right. So in other words, it's taking that last element in the row and it's throwing it all the way to the right. The advantage of this is it helps with any of that subpixel rendering, so that if there's maybe a pixel off, that you don't see the gap on this right-hand side. It floats that last thing over, so it's always flush to the right. Now, if I want to change that, if I don't want that, for some reason that's messing things up, I can just change that to from, and we're going to see that the float changes to a left. So it's from the left over to the right instead of to their back. All right. Where does this come in play? Well, it really makes a difference if you have elements that aren't always filling up the entire space. And I can show you the difference here as we jump down and look at columns. Columns is kind of pretty obvious. It allows you to change the number of columns that are in your layout. I'm making things kind of assuming an 8-column grid. So when I change this to 12. So when I change this to 10, things kind of break because I am counting up to 10 in a lot of things. I'm saying take up 8 spaces and you take up 2 spaces, and they don't fit together, obviously. But if I do something like 14, you can see there's that extra space on the end. So I actually have 14 columns, and I'm not filling up all of my columns before I clear my float down to these, these next guys down here. Now this makes a big difference. This last flow from or to, I change it to 2. You see that last element has a float right. So it's all the way over to the right, regardless of if those 2 elements filled up the entire row or not. So that's certainly something where that last flow is going to come into play if for some reason you have layouts that don't always fill up the entire rows. That last flow will make a big difference. If you're being really calculated about the number of elements, it's usually not that big of a deal. Also, if you have like, say down here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. If you don't have the 6th one, this is not typically considered the last because when you do last, it's usually like an nth child thing. So it's not doing like last of. It's actually doing there's some different ways to go about it. So it's not it's using nth child stuff. So this would not flow over to the right. We can actually change that right here. Last to from, and you can see whether I do from, that doesn't get moved over because it's an nth child issue. It's not the last element of that row. Anyway, long and the short of it is, don't worry about that. All right, so let's go back and let's take a look at what else we can do. So the next thing we've got are gutters. The gutters are the space between all these elements. You see here, I've got a couple different things going on. I've got a row of 2 elements up top, and the elements inside of it, there's actually 4 items nested in here, and then we've got these like 3 up down below. And you see all of my gutters are identically the same size. And this is, this is the beautiful thing, is we have this line right down here. Without even having to mess with numbers, these line up perfectly. And I can change what that size is. If I have it set at 1, it means that the gutters are the exact same size as a column. So these are, I think these are 2 columns each. So these are basically 2 columns, and there's actually an extra gutter in there. So that's why the math doesn't look exactly the same. But there's 2 of these plus 1 more inside of that. I can also change that to fractions or percentages, and you see that'll drop down the size. I can drop it really low if I want to. I can also use fractions. If I do fractions right, you can do a quarter, you can do half, you can do third. So if you're doing your math that way, obviously 1/3 is a lot easier to write out than 0.333333, hoping that you wrote out enough 3s. Yeah, so that's that. Gutter position. This is really handy because this makes Susy extremely flexible in that you have a lot of different ways to handle your gutters. Right now, you can see that I have here's this div of 1, and it's got a margin to the right, and then this one would have a margin to the right, but it's the last of a row, so that's set to 0. So you can also see in here, these all have margin to the right, except for the last one, which is set to 0. So if we don't always have to do the margin being after, we can also have the margin before. And you can see it looks identical. The difference now is the first one in the row has a margin left of 0, whereas the second one does have that margin left. And same thing going down here. The first one, 4n plus 1, has a margin left of 0, and the other ones have margin lefts. So you can go either way. The advantage here is when you do margin on the left, you only have to know what the first element in a row is. The last element of the row doesn't matter because everything else is going to be flush to the right. But in this case, you do have to specify what the first one is so that it doesn't get that margin left. So mileage may vary, depends on how you like to use it, but the options are there. All right, so next one is split. Split allows you to put the margin on each side of it. So it actually doesn't matter which one's first or last, because everything gets a margin on each side. Just like that. Hopefully you can see that. So the margins are split around it. Personally, I kind of like it everything flush because then things line up a whole lot better. But if you do this consistently, it works pretty well also. There's also inside, which basically puts the margins inside. So it uses padding instead of margins. Puts the gutter inside, is a better way to say it. So if you go inside, one of the neat thing about this is if you watch closely, the text doesn't move. The text stays exactly where it's supposed to be, but the background is going to fill in all of those gutters. Boom, like that. So the text stays exactly where it is. Everything lines up. This text lines up with that. Even though these are nested inside and all of that. But it uses padding. You see here padding instead of margins, so that those borders collapse. This is kind of how a lot of the simpler grid systems like Bootstrap grids and whatnot, they just use padding like that. There's some big disadvantages with this because sometimes you don't want that background color. You actually want a visible gutter between your backgrounds. So I'm usually not a fan of inside, but it's there as an option. All right. Lastly, there's also inside static, because you can see these padding values are still percentages. And to do this, I need to go give column width. All right. Inside static as well. And what that's going to do, apparently I can go a little bigger columns. There we go. Inside static actually uses static values, as the name would hence apply. So it has padding left, padding right of an actual static pixel value. And that's how that works. Cool. All right, let's get away from that. I'm not a fan. Let's go back to after. All right. So the next thing we've got here is global box sizing. Now this one's a little confusing because this actually isn't changing your environment from content box to border box. It's changing how Susy does the math. So for instance, and I need to actually be back on inside. Let's go with this. Because content box versus border box doesn't really have an effect on margins, but has a huge effect on how it calculates padding. Because it's the question of is padding included, padding and borders actually, is that included in the size of the box or not? So this inside is really where it comes into effect. So currently I'm doing content box, which means that the padding is included. I can't try to remember what it is. No, the padding is added on. So the width plus the padding equals the actual space it takes up in the DOM. So I can change this to border box if I want to. What's going to happen is Susy's now going to assume you have border box, and it's going to use border box math. And it breaks. And you're like, what? Why is it breaking? Well, it's because Susy might be using border box for its math, but you don't actually have border box set on all of your code. That's where something like this comes in handy for actually setting all of your elements to border box. So if I add that to the mix, now it works. So now the actual width, the total width, the padding doesn't add on to the width to get the final value. That's basically what it is. So if you are going to use border box, just remember that, and actually I suggest using border box because I'm usually is that you do need to have border box actually set. Susy doesn't do that for you. At least to my understanding, it does not. So we'll just go back to content box and we're good to go. So those are the main grid settings. Let's go back to after. There's a couple debug settings that I want to walk through that are really kind of nice. Debug basically allows you to troubleshoot and kind of figure out your grid a little bit better. So it's currently hidden. Let's go ahead and show it. And look at that. All right. And one thing about these grids is that the math is extremely imprecise. And so you see these gaps here. And that's because depending on the size of your screen, it's going to be different. You see I'm there, it works fine. And then you go one more click and it jumps. So it's using like, I think a background gradient, and it's really hard to, they just don't line up. They'll get you close. So you kind of know like if you're on or off. If you get the screen to the right size, it'll work, they'll line up perfectly. Just know that it's not a bug, it's just the way that these background images work. So there they're set up. I can go ahead and change the RGB value that's used for that background, because I always like typing pink for some reason, as well as the opacity of that. It's just the RGBA. There you go. All right, this next one's kind of cool. Right now, these are backgrounds. They're obviously behind everything. So if we had a bunch of stuff in this header up top, and we had a couple different columns, but there's all this background, solid background, you wouldn't be able to see the grid. We can actually do this as an overlay instead. So let me see, show overlay. There we go. Now, because you don't want the overlay to get in the way all the time, it also has this toggle option of where do you want the toggle to be. You see when I hover over this toggle, the grid shows up, which is really nice. So it's like you're working away and you're like, all right, I know where things are in the grid, and things are lining up, they're where I want, my code's not wrong, life is good and grand and all that kind of stuff. So that's nice. So we can go top right if our navigation's over there, we can move it to the left, we can move it to the bottom, those kind of things. So that's what the toggle allows you to do, and the debugging and out the background versus overlay. So we'll hide this again. There's actually some options in here as well to show baseline grid if you have baseline grid stuff set up. I didn't get that working yet, but the option's there. You'll probably see it in the notes. This last use custom, I'm going to go through it pretty quick because it really doesn't affect this demo at all. The idea is that we've got Susy does a lot of custom things. like for creating these background images, it's a background image, and it uses a particular mixin to create that background image. Well, there are some better background image mixins that Bourbon and Compass use, as well as some of the background options like background size mixins, which have to do also with the vendor prefixes and all those types of things. So these true or false is whether you want Susy to look for those other things before using its fallback. So background image is true. So it's basically saying, go and look and see if there is a background image mixin somewhere else within our code, whether we wrote it or whether it's coming from Bourbon or whether it's coming from Compass. If you can't find it, use the fallback. But if it's there, go ahead and use it. In this case, we've got background options set to false. It's saying just use ours. Don't worry about if there's something else, just use ours. Same thing with a box sizing mixin with your clear fix, because there's certain functions that will put a clear fix in. You might have your own clear fix that you want to use, as well as like a rem mixin. So if you have really specific rem mixins and clear fixes and those kind of things that you want to use, you can specify that versus using the internal ones. So that's just the settings, and that took me 26 minutes. So as you can see, you can do a lot with Susy to really customize the way that your grid is set up. And the great thing is you can actually have multiple of these grids within your system, so that you can say, hey, for this instance, I want for this instance, I want to use this grid. For this instance, I want to use this grid. And I just realized there's a show item when I click on it. I don't know what this show item is doing. Sorry, there's links in the sides, and I can click and show item. They'll probably show up in the video or something. That's kind of cool. We'll see how that comes out. It's a new feature. Anyway, so there you go. That is Susy settings. And as you can tell, we've got a lot more to do. Next week, I'm gonna come back and actually start writing some Susy code. You can get a quick view of how I wrote that Susy code in that Sassmeister gist. Again, I had to do lots of kind of extraneous code in there to make it work with all of the different container positions and gutter positions and all sorts of stuff. So that's not how I would write production code, because I would pick one of those positions and stick with it. But we're going to get back to that. We're going to show how to do some pretty complex layouts, as well as some of the more complex features. And if I get really, really ambitious, one of the great things about Susy is it allows you to write your own output engine. Maybe we'll try and write a simple Flexbox output engine or something crazy like that. So it should be a fun trip. I'm sure it'll take me a few weeks to get through all this. So stick around. Feel free to tweet questions at me. I'm kind of learning it as I go as well. And Eric's been awesome about kind of helping me through that learning too. So hope you enjoyed it. Feel free to tweet questions and retweet this out and have fun. And I'm sure I will see you next week. Later.